So, and then on page 53, there is discussion on a change in an economic system, for example, will result in changes in other systems. And so that relates to a little bit about our discussion in week 2 on the Personal Responsibility and Welfare Work Opportunity Act, or Medicare or Medicaid or Social Security. If something in those acts or pieces of legislation change, then that affects a whole bunch of other things, including people. So, and that's why it's so important that we have a good understanding of how to conduct policy analysis, and when someone else conducts policy analysis, to be able to critique their analysis, because again, they're viewing that policy and their data from their perspective. On page 54, the authors talk on the second column about equifinality. And when I was reading this, the final state of a system can be achieved in many different ways. I was thinking about, multiple universes. If you are a sci-fi fan, which I am, and I love Star Trek and the different forms it's appeared, they've had shows on multiple universes, and that's sort of what I think about when I read about equifinality, that there can be many different ways to go about doing something. And so, and they mentioned that equifinality is important to social workers because their role is to help clients determine what's best for them, not for social workers to determine what's best for the client, right? Under critiques of the system's ecological framework, again, I want to emphasize that it's so important to be able to critique a theory or perspective and paradigms so that you have a good understanding of how that works and what you need to be considering in order to critique it, and to be able to critique other people's critiques. And so it's very important to look at what a theory or perspective or a paradigm does help us see and what it doesn't. And so they talk about criticisms of this framework, but they don't talk about very many, which is too bad because there are others. They do mention that the system's ecological perspective is often referred to as biopsychosocial cultural framework, and that cultural part is a recent addition. We used to only talk about biopsychosocial, and before that we only talked about psychosocial, so it's continually evolving. Let's see. The Ambrosino chapter talks about 4 levels of the environment or systems, and I just wanted to point out that Farley only talks about 3. So Ambrosino's mesosystem, M-E-S-O, is the same thing as mezzo, M-E-Z-Z-O, and then their exosystem and their macrosystem are kind of differentiating a little bit between some factors in Farley's use of only the macro system. But the exosystem and the macro system in Ambrosino are pretty much related to the same thing as Farley's macro system. So again, people talking about and viewing things a little bit differently. And then on page 58 in the second column, the authors point out, and I wanted to emphasize, near the right above the Problems in Living title, it says, it is not as important to focus on where in the environment each factor fits as it is to focus on the interrelations and how they influence each other. So what they're saying is, don't get too freaked out about trying to figure out, does this thing go in the meso or the macro or whatever. But really, it's just important for you to know that there are different levels of understanding in systems, and that it's more important to understand the relationships and how they affect each other from the client's perspective than it is necessarily to make sure you get it right and put things in their right place. So it's just a tool, but there's not necessarily a right way to use these tools. On page 59, under the first column, they talk about, they have a summary that the systems ecological framework really focuses on how our choices shape our environment and our environment shapes our choices. So they really do have the cyclical effect. And then on page 59, the second column, under the utility of the systems ecological framework, second paragraph, they mention many individuals may have a one-dimensional way of explaining the problem. A systems ecological perspective would identify many factors. And that is so true. I can't tell you how many people say, oh, people on welfare are just lazy. Or, people who are homeless are just lazy. And it just shows how one-dimensional or how uninformed, really, that people are on a subject, and that sometimes people want to hold to their stereotypes or their way of thinking about something than they do really to want to investigate an idea. But so that's why it's so important for social workers to have to be open and to have some education and really think about and analyze and critique these different ways of looking at the world, because once we sort of choose which ones more or less resonate with us, because we all do choose them, and we choose parts that kind of fit who we are, our personality, then that's going to affect how we work with our clients. So it's really important to take a look at each of these and see what they mean and analyze them, critique them, before we decide to take them on. And they mention at the bottom of 59, once the larger picture is obtained, we can better ascertain where to focus, where we might need more information, and what appropriate interventions would be to take. So really important to do that. On page 62, on the second column under cognitive behavioral framework, so this is where we're looking at some other perspectives that can be useful in social work in the helping fields. So cognitive behavioralism, it primarily looks at behaviors and how people think about things. And so if someone does a lot of negative thinking, it's going to affect their behaviors. And so we look at how to help people, if they want to, change their negative thinking. And so, they talk a little bit about cognitive. So cognition is how we think about things, and then behavior. So, but they mentioned that it's extremely useful to social workers, and I got a lot of education and training in cognitive behavioralism, and I find that it has been really valuable in my practice. And then they talk about political and ideological frameworks. Oh, I skipped a page. I'm sorry. Okay, well, I'll go back. I was talking earlier about politics and how social workers aren't as involved in politics as, it used to be. And so they mention, a little bit about what I mentioned, that that even though someone may call themselves a libertarian or a Democrat or something like that, that often their perspective on an issue may change, and so they may not, always fit nicely into this one label. And so that's another reason why it's really important to consider language and labeling. And that's what labeling theory is about, and you may learn about that more later on, but in your education. The labeling theory looks at who's labeling and why and what it does to people. So I'm going to stop here and do one final part.